All right. Hi, everyone. So we don't have much time, so we're going to skip all lengthy introductions. For Felix, do you want to tell us what your company sort of does and what your business model is to set the stage?
Sure. So we're Collibra. Collibra is a data intelligence company. So we help accelerate business outcomes by connecting the right data, algorithms, reports to the right, to all data consumers. So we offer a cloud-based platform to give mostly large organizations better visibility across all of their data, across their whole data landscape. We automate data workflows. We connect IT to the business to ultimately build a lot of trust and confidence in the data, to help build a true data culture, and kind of to support digital transformation, which is really based on data. About 500 people started in Belgium, but today headquarters is here in New York.
So what kind of businesses in the financial sector do you work with?
Yeah,
and what do you help them do, I guess?
Of course, and it's really across every aspect of the financial sector. It's all of the global banks. It's asset managers, hedge funds, insurance companies, payments providers, credit card providers. It's really across. And there's really three aspects that we typically help them. One is around data governance, which is really about trust in data. And that really started in 2008 after the financial crisis, where all of the banks had to comply with new regulations, CCAR, BCBS, and so on. So that's still a big part of what we do, but we have seen that change over time as data is becoming much more valuable as well. So the second part that we help them is with data catalog, and we call that the Amazonification of data in a way, to help every data consumer easily find the right data, be able to trust it. So just as you shop for data or shop for products on Amazon, you would shop for data in our data catalog. And then the third aspect is around privacy. And that's a big trend that we're seeing. It started with GDPR in Europe, now CCPA. It's a continuous trend. And so that's how we're helping a lot of the large banks. We had our user conference 2 weeks ago here in New York, and we had what we call Collibra Data Excellence Awards. And so American Express got the Best Data Program Award. JP Morgan won the Data Citizens Award. Lloyd's won an award as well. And so that's really how we're helping all of those banks, insurance companies, credit card providers, and so on.
Jan, why did you invest in Collibra?
Yeah, thank you, Anna, and good to be here at CB Insights. We've been investing in data for a long time, and actually some of the world's largest companies, yours included, whether that's Thomson Reuters, Bloomberg, IHS Markit, IDC, and the list goes on. Some of those largest companies are data companies, and I would go even further, that every company is becoming a data company. You could say data is the new oil. And with that, we'll look for huge markets where we can build these sizable businesses. So we've been looking for companies that can organize the wealth of data that gets created in enterprises. And just like you could make the analogy with Salesforce being the register of companies, or Workday being the register of employees in an enterprise, we've been looking for a sort of a master manager of data. And there we stumbled upon Collibra, a company sort of with a modest background out of Brussels, but expanding very fast. We were alerted to it when a large financial institution purchased a multi-million-dollar license, and this was a startup with 50 or so employees. Yep. We were immediately, we jumped on the opportunity, and there we found a team with a massive ambition to organize data that sits within enterprises. So it didn't take too long for us to get together with Felix and the team.
So you invest in both B2C fintech companies like Robinhood and Wealthfront, and then also B2B companies. How do you think differently about the two? What is the approach?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. If I were sitting here 10 years ago, I would say the world of technology divides into these two parts, consumer and business, and the line between the two is blurring. At the core, Collibra is a business application, and what's beautiful about it is once an enterprise customer purchases the solution, you then offer that solution to business users for practical day-to-day use cases. Where do I find my data? Who can use it? Where did it come from? Can I trust it? Is it compliant? What can it be used for? And ultimately, every one of us is in one shape or form a data user. And that's where the line between consumer and business gets blurred. And sort of in the tech speak, we call it prosumerization. And many companies have taken that model even further. And whether that's Dropbox or Slack, ultimately start with one user, and the solution then propagates across the enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what the journey has been like from you in 10 years in dealing with financial companies, how their attitude has changed towards data, and how that's affected you as a company and struggles?
Massively. It's very interesting. Like, we started the company almost 11 years ago. Nobody cared that much about data at the time. We were like shouting in the desert how important data is. But interestingly, we looked at it recently. You had the whole rise of the chief data officer, which I think is a great proxy to see and look at how important data has become for every company nowadays. And I think Capital One was actually the first one that appointed a chief data officer. I think it was in 2002. I think by 2014, there were just 400 CDOs. I think 2017, there were 4,000. And today, there's over 10,000. So 80% of large companies have a chief data officer now. And so I think that speaks to the change that we've seen in data and the importance of data. And so obviously, that has had a massive impact on us. When we started, it was, again, very difficult. But then I think the financial crisis happened. And so suddenly, all of the large banks had to comply with these new regulations, BCBS, SECR, and so on. And so that's really when those large companies started to take notice. But then we've seen a massive shift towards focusing, I would say, on defense and control and managing the chaos, to actually focusing on how do we drive value? How do we leverage data to be more better serve our customers, build better products, drive faster outcomes? And I think that's where AI, machine learning, analytics, big data has really come in. But again, you need to build that foundation to be able to leverage those new technologies. And I think that's really, really critical. And that's where, again, the trust and confidence and data needs to happen. And I would say what we see the biggest challenge today is not having a bigger or faster database. We believe the cloud providers are going to abstract that complexity away. I think that they're going to kind of own that problem. For us, what we see today, it's really much more of a people and process problem. Because today you have, and Jan said it as well, you have so many people, everybody basically consumes and produces data. And so everybody is working with data, needs data, and so it becomes chaos. And so you need to be able to cope with that chaos, build confidence, build trust, automate workflows for you to be able to really leverage data to actually drive real outcomes around some of the emerging technology. And that's a big shift that we've seen, and we've seen the same thing kind of with the rise of and the growth of the company.
So are they there on the managing the chaos? The thing that I struggle with is now everybody will talk to me about AI and machine learning, and it's the future, everyone at a bank, right? But it's hard to concretely get a sense of what they're actually doing. Have they sorted out the mess behind the scenes, or are people still in that phase, and then hopefully you're going to get to the cool AI stuff?
And I think the right approach is to do it in parallel a little bit. Like, you don't try to fix the chaos all the time, because I mean, it is extremely complex, and these are very large, complex organizations that do a lot of different things, that have a lot of legacy as well. So I do see a lot of things happening. I was talking to one person from a large US bank, and that does a lot around kind of voice data and leveraging AI, machine learning to identify when there's a complaint, how they need to act to that complaint, things like that. So things are definitely happening, and you see that shift. I think companies are now realizing that they need that foundation. As they kind of move to the cloud, how do you do that to enable them to go faster? But again, just moving to the cloud in that complex environment is not easy. Again, you need to identify what data do you have, how do you prioritize it, how do you bring it to the cloud, how do you remain in control over everything? Because, I mean, regulatory compliance, privacy remains an important factor. So I think things are changing, and it is moving. We've seen a big mind shift over the last 5 years as they move from defense to offense. When we talked to chief data officers 5 years ago, it was just, I need to be compliant. That's my #1 priority. First today is, yes, I still need to be compliant, but how can we leverage data to do AI, machine learning, all these things? So we have seen a big shift.
And just one follow-up. We were chatting before about the structure of chief data officers. Who do they normally report to, and in which cases do you see that as being more effective for the bank as a whole? Are they within the tech organization? Is it better if they report to the CEO? Who owns the data? Is it the businesses?
Yeah, and again, similar to that shift that you're seeing, then especially in financial services, they're not often reporting to IT. They're often reporting, especially initially, to a kind of a chief administration officer, CFO, a chief risk officer, given that initially it was all about compliance, regulatory. Now that's changing somewhat, and we have chief data officers that are reporting to the CEO. And the way they talked about it internally to their CEO said, look, your CFO, if you really treat data as an enterprise asset, which is easy to say but hard to do, you need to treat it seriously, and it is not just an IT infrastructure thing. It's really a business conversation, and so we really have seen that shift where CDOs today very much report to the business.
And Jan, so what other areas of sort of, aside from governance, what other areas of data in finance are you guys looking at, or solutions that you think need problems that need solutions that you would be willing to invest in?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. There's obviously this curve of evolution. First, historically, the problem has been to collect data, and historically, the debate has been about how do I harvest it, because the implicit assumption has been we're going to then use it and mine it. Then comes this cloud movement, as Felix describes, which is an infrastructure problem that Collibra is not solving, where to store it. But then, of course, it leads to these problems, how it can be used. And to me, a perfect example is the case of insurance, where you may have the perfect master database of all customer contacts, but the underwriting department is not allowed to know whether the person for whom the insurance is written is Mr. or Mrs. Smith. But on the other hand, the customer relations department precisely needs to know it because you want to customize your communication. So a large insurance company sits on all this data, but it becomes a business problem how to use it. Where we see the next set of trends is around a couple of trends with the data. One is where the intervention around it is human. And again, automation, you mentioned the word AI. It tends to be an abused word, but if you look at examples like real estate, we still value companies out there in the world, and sort of mortgages are written and securitization is done on a lot of manual valuation where we're relying on a human judgment. And we have made an investment in that space in a company called Geophy that automates valuation modeling based on a data hose of thousands of data points, data sources, so that manual intervention and the resulting error can be eliminated. Another area is around what we would call the agency problem, where a perfect example is credit ratings in the fixed income markets, or any sort of bond or lending markets, where today's rating agencies essentially get paid by those whose securities are being rated, leading to an inherent conflict of interest. So there are better ways of harvesting data that may be a byproduct of a certain other activity that would reveal sort of the true price of risk. And most in the room will know that that's how Market was built in the CDS space. So there are multiple sort of paths to extend the usefulness of data, but what they all have in common is that these are business applications, and ultimately the use of data removes an opinion and removes subjectivity, which then leads to better allocation of capital or resource.
Mm. You mentioned regulation before as sort of a driver for business, but is it also used as a way to not do things, or is it holding back, I guess, banks from doing more with what they have?
I think it definitely puts kind of constraints around what is possible, but I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it is important that we care about privacy and protection, especially on that side. I think that's a trend that we're seeing, and I think that's going to be important. Yes, for the regulation, but I think also, and even more, I think from a branding perspective, and especially I think in financial services, trust is such a core part of the value proposition, and if you lose that trust, and we've all heard the stories with the data breaches and so on, I think that's really, really problematic, and I think that's a real differentiator. And so doing the right thing from a privacy and protection perspective, yes, for the regulation, but really in everything that you do is just really, really important. It's imperative, and I think that's something that we believe where regulation and doing it right is actually an enabler to do better business. It's a forcing function to build the foundation in the right way. So if you do that correctly, you can actually leverage the work that you were doing there to do kind of AI, machine learning, and all these things effectively, because that we've seen problems there as well around kind of ethics around machine learning and AI, around bias in algorithms. These are real important problems, because if an algorithm is going to decide whether you get a loan or not, you got to be able to trust that that's being trained correctly, and the training is all in the data. So how do we know that data set actually correctly represents things like that? And it's also not just a US and Europe thing. I mean, we're talking to a large Indian bank that's clearly very concerned around privacy. Same with a big Australian bank that cares a lot about privacy. I think it's a worldwide trend that we're seeing. And I think it's actually an opportunity to do it right. Because if we do it wrong, I think the impact is going to be negative.
Yeah, and do you have any?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Felix. Depends what data you feed in, you get the corresponding outcome. And the perfect day-to-day analogy is driving on the road and putting one phone on Waze and one phone on Google Maps. And even though Waze is owned by Google, you're going to get two different sets of directions very often. And which brings me to the point that you're fundamentally asking about regulation, where a lot of the systems have been developed on data mining your own data set. Perfect example would be financial crime, where there's a time lag, there's thresholds, but different countries have different reporting requirements. Example would be the regulation around PEPs, who are politically exposed persons, to be able to do business with or send transfers or receive transfers. And a definition of a PEP in Canada is different than a definition of PEP in the United States, is different in the United Kingdom. And therefore, the threshold on what data set is included versus excluded is different. And therefore, the system employed by Royal Bank of Scotland would be different than the system deployed by Royal Bank of Canada, which, if you step back, sort of doesn't really make sense. And what I would say is what would be a more ideal solution if the regulators were able to go to the next step and sort of allow for some sort of data sharing, where data sharing is there for the common good. And again, we've seen these kind of contributed data models around in other markets, but they have typically been beneficial to ultimately well-functioning of all participants in the market. So financial crime would be one perfect example where you want pooling of all data possible worldwide to get a better outcome for all.
Do you think regulatory pressures around data are going to continue? You talked about the influence of tech on business. In this case, what's going on the consumer side with data and privacy and big social networks? Will that just increase the pressure on all types of firms, including banks whose thresholds are already quite high? Or do you think we'll get more, the fact that there'll be more clarity will actually just end up being more helpful than not?
I think on the privacy side, it's going to continue. And it's really the balance, because on the one hand, if we all believe that data is becoming more valuable, then it's also becoming more risky, because there's more to be lost, right? And the impact of a loss is going to be greater. And so I think you need to manage that risk, right? And so in that sense, as the impact increases, you need to manage the risk better from a privacy, security, protection, and financial risk as well. So we think it's going to continue to evolve. I think it's going to iterate. I think after the financial crisis, we had the first regulation, BCBS, I think version 1, 2, 3, and so on. And so I think GDPR is going to evolve, CCPA is going to evolve. There's going to be other regulations, hopefully federal regulations, so you don't have to, there's not different things in every single state. So I think that's going to happen for the next foreseeable future, we believe. They're hopefully becoming more practical and pragmatic, because I think that's an important approach. But I don't think it's going to go away, given just data is becoming only more valuable. And I think the other part, again, back to kind of automation, AI, machine learning, is how do we deal with that? Because I think there's a lot of things we don't know yet. How can you still train algorithms if you need to do it on private data, for example? Privacy by design, contextual awareness, all these things are really important. And so I think it's going to continue.
Do you have any thoughts on?
Definitely agree with Felix on this part. The regulation of the data will become more granular, I would say. And I think ultimately there will be a trade-off between sort of what's permitted to use for what, and that's where the data management solutions at the business level really come to the forefront. So I would say we're at the very, very beginning in terms of what can be used. I think there's a lot of confusion around inability to use any data versus just permissioning to use data. And a lot of people have heard the acronym of GDPR, but it's sort of completely misused in terms of it doesn't mean that you cannot know your customer. In fact, the other regulation says you must know your customer. So by definition, it would seem that there's a conflict. It's really more about how the data can be used.
Might we get more fragmentation geographically? And if so, like US regulators doing one thing, the EU doing another, and if so, what does it mean in practice for the businesses you work for? How do they have a global data strategy? Do they just adopt the toughest one and then?
I think we're figuring it out and it's changing. And we had one case where a company wanted to know what data center they were actually storing customer data. Because it actually, there's real implications. And so again, if you don't have visibility across your data landscape, you're just not in the know, and that's a real danger. So I think step one is just get the visibility, and so as the regulation evolves, at least you have the ability to do the right thing. But I think it's going to take time, and you will see different regulations. Hopefully, it's going to come to one standard or some kind of standard. But I think that's gonna take time, and we're first gonna see more fragmentation, I believe. I think it's gonna be interesting to see how the cloud providers actually deal with that as well. But I think it's gonna be more fragmented before it kind of becomes, hopefully ever, more standardized.
So you raised a lot of money recently, and you're now valued at more than $1 billion. What have you been investing in the business, and what are you going to be doing in the next year?
Yeah, I mean, we keep investing heavily in the business on the one hand to kind of cope with the growth, and on the other hand, of course, to drive more growth. I think a big part of our investment needs to be in our platform. Kind of AI automation becomes a big part of it, because just the complexity of data today, you can't do it manually anymore. That's why we're excited to partner with Google on that as kind of one of the most mature data and AI companies out there. So building out that platform that gives companies the foundation, that visibility. Second, we're really becoming a real strategic partner to some of the largest companies in the world. Of course, a lot of the global banks, but also beyond retail, technology, healthcare, pharma, things like that. And we want to make sure as we build the company, we are serving them in that way as a strategic partner, so investing in our customer, advisory, support, all of that. And then finally, I think on the global growth, today it's mostly US and Europe where we're active. I mentioned India, Australia. I think these problems are international and global. And so kind of global expansion is definitely part of our investments.
Okay, so we're going to play the overrated, underrated. The first one is artificial intelligence.
I would say underrated, although it's hard to increase the hype around it. But I think it's interesting to think about what we don't know that we don't know. And I think it's just, I don't know. That's why I would say underrated.
I would say also underrated. It's a big buzzword, but I would say we're at the beginning. And what we look at from an investment standpoint is companies that use AI as opposed to sort of create esoteric academic projects.
Blockchain.
Blockchain. I'd say overrated. I'm not the expert, but I don't yet really see the concrete applications and benefits. So I would go with overrated.
Overrated.
And the last one, which is a lot less sexy than blockchain, GDPR.
Well, given what I just told you, I probably can't guess my answer, but I would say underrated. Not because of the regulation in of itself, but I think just the realization of how important privacy has become. As we think about digital transformation, it's all about the data, and if we don't have the trust of our consumers to actually do something with the data, all of that actually goes away, so I would say underrated.
Yeah, data is the new oil, so massively underrated.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.